Yeah, I'd like to welcome you back to the Sustainable Urban Governance class. This is video number 7 in a series. Starting with video number 6, what I did was go back to the 98 slide PowerPoint presentation, and I'm encouraging people who have access to these slides to put them on their desktop so they can go back and forth after watching me give this lecture, and then kind of look at the slides themselves. Sustainability planning and design is the second leg of the three-legged approach to sustainable urban governance. And just to recap, the first leg was assets, public capital. Now we're on sustainability planning and design. And then the last one is public wealth. And I'll be getting you that in video number 8. But what I wanted to do now is talk a little bit about some of the key concepts in that section of the slides section of this lecture. The first one is the concept of life cycle analysis. This is something that is well understood by engineers, but sometimes when you have government officials that are in office for 2 years, 4 years, they can't see a need to be looking beyond their term in office. But it always comes up to bite you after a while. But life cycle analysis is the concept that you spend a lot of money up front in a capital project, and then over the years you spend a little bit on whatever's appropriate on maintenance, and then after 4, 5, 10 years, whatever's required, there's a significant investment they have to make to bring the original infrastructure back to where it was at the beginning. And then you go back to another cycle of year after year of doing increasingly additional expenditures to keep the infrastructure up. But at some point, you have to say, well, we're at the life span of the infrastructure, and then start planning for brand new infrastructure, tear down what was there and go back. Technology might have changed over the years, but that's one of the ideas that's important in sustainable urban governance. Is the idea that you have to keep infrastructure up to date. Another important concept in this topic is the difference between strategic and tactical planning. It's confusing to some people, but you need to keep in mind that whenever you talk about strategic planning, you're always talking about 5, 10, 50 years, 100 years, generational type approach, where you're setting bounds for what you're going to look at as tactical, which is something I'm going to talk about in a second. The idea is that you're looking for something beyond what you're going to be doing next week. If you need to have a change in philosophy, in economics or politics, strategic is the kind of thing that you do. Now, in the tactical approach, this is where you set on a strategic approach, and what you're doing now is what's the most efficient way of achieving that strategic goal. So it's kind of like you want to take Iwo Jima, for example, the tactical approach. We got to get a beachhead. We have to get our guns ready, those kind of things. So it's those very critical things that you need to do to achieve the short-range goal, so that you can achieve the strategic purpose. The other thing I want to talk about is this idea of how do you plan for urban infrastructure so that it's sustainable. The approach that I present in these slides has to do with the what I call the 4-step airplane trip cycle analogy. It's a mouthful, but the idea is if you look at the life cycle analysis and you look at the initial expenditure on infrastructure, that's similar to like getting ready to take off of the airplane analogy. And then as you built the infrastructure and you're starting to use it, that's kind of like taking off, and you're starting at a cruising speed. And as you're maintaining the infrastructure over the years, that's keeping on the cruising level. At some point you have to realize that the infrastructure has got to be replaced, and that's kind of like the setting for the landing of the airplane. The thing that you try to do is to have airplane getting ready to take off, taking off, cruising, and then having those peaks kind of on top of themselves so that you don't ever miss the usefulness of the infrastructure. So that's in the slides. You'll see the budding up of the getting ready, taking off, and then cruising. So all the cruisings are set next to each other. That's what I was trying to get at on that slide. Another concept in the sustainability planning design is what I've done, and I'm not going to get into each of the authors. You can call me up or come to the class and ask me about it. But I take the example of Timothy Beatley and Manning's 3 stages of planning, which are called sustainable places, which is the level that they are today. But prior to sustainable places was growth management and land use planning and zoning. What they've done take the process over the years and say that land use planning and zoning from the 1900s, 1970s was a failed mechanism to control urban sprawl. Then they saw that growth management in the 70s and the 80s, for example, in Florida, Oregon, and some of the other cities, it was urban growth accommodation. And then now we're in this phase of sustainability planning called sustainable places, where it's compact, vibrant cities as part of the answer to the urban sprawl. What I've done with that is map out the 4 stages that I came up with that explain a sustainable place. And comparison-wise, I had a concept called open access, where there are no rules. It's kind of like wilderness. The next stage within the resource management regime is called private management, where people just came to the area, started using resources, came up with systems that they could all live by. But at a certain point, government regulation was necessary, for example, in pollution or noise control or obnoxiousness, I guess. You needed state management rules, environmental laws, and such. Very few cities or regions or ecosystems have come to the system of common pool management. And common pool is that stage where people have decided, look, the state approach is not working. We need to do some kind of cooperative venture. That approach is similar to some of the other concepts that I have in these slides, and rather than go into a lot of them, what I've developed is 4 authors that equally present something that kind of coincides. And I put it in terms of the hope crisis continuum, which you can see on the slides itself. The idea that we all live within a continuum between hope and crisis, and as we move toward the right, toward more crisis, crisis increases to a certain point, and then it falls off where it's non-sustainable. And what I've positioned all these various things that the authors have talked about is a way of looking at where you are within governance, is that you always try to don't deny that you've got a problem, but if you do have a problem, recognize it and start reconciling. And the sooner that you can reconcile problems is where you're going to make sure that you are at the top of your sustainability. One of the things I think is important in this is the concept of what urban infrastructure is and what wealth is and what private wealth is. I'm going to kind of lay that down right now because we've got to move on to the next presentation. But I'll be coming back and pick up this conversation on sustainable planning and design. So see you in a second.